2 verses. That is all the Bible gives us. 2 verses, buried in the 6th chapter of Genesis, describing something so strange, so brief, and so unexplained that ancient readers spent the next 1,000 years trying to make sense of it. Sons of God, daughters of men, beings who came down, and offspring, the text calls the Nephilim, a word so difficult to translate with any confidence that most Bibles simply leave it untranslated as a name, because no other single word quite captures what the original writers meant by it. 2 verses, and then Genesis moves on almost immediately to the story of Noah and the flood, as if it hadn't just described heavenly beings crossing into the human world and fathering children with mortal women. It didn't move on for everyone, though. For centuries afterward, entire Jewish communities could not simply let this story go. They wrote pages about it, chapters, whole scrolls, carefully copied and preserved. They gave the story a named leader, a face, a set of crimes far more specific than anything Genesis records. A name that would echo through Jewish and Christian tradition for 2,000 years, spoken in whispers, in warnings, in later texts the Bible itself never fully explains, but occasionally, surprisingly, quotes. Azazel. Who was he? What did he teach humanity that was considered so dangerous it required direct divine punishment? And why did Genesis, of all places, a book usually so careful about genealogy and detail, choose to say almost nothing about one of the strangest events it records? Let's be honest, right from the start, about what we're doing tonight, and just as importantly, about what we are not doing. We are not claiming a secret text was deliberately hidden from the Bible by some ancient conspiracy. We are not claiming the Nephilim were extraterrestrial visitors, or that Azazel is a proven historical figure whose literal existence can somehow be confirmed through archaeology. Those are popular claims in certain corners of the internet, but they are claims made without real evidence, and we will not repeat them here as though they were established fact. What we are going to do instead is trace, honestly and carefully, how a 2-verse mystery in the book of Genesis grew, over several centuries, into one of the most detailed angelic mythologies to survive from the ancient Jewish world. Through a text called 1 Enoch, through the Dead Sea Scrolls that confirmed its ancient roots, and through the writings of the New Testament itself, which references this tradition far more directly than most modern readers ever realize. By the end of tonight's investigation, you will understand not just who the Watchers were said to be and what they were said to have done, but why their story mattered so deeply to ancient readers that the memory of it survived for 2 full millennia, preserved and studied even outside their own official scripture. To understand why the story of the Watchers took root so deeply and spread so widely, we need to first understand the specific anxieties of the ancient world that first received it. The centuries surrounding the composition of texts like 1 Enoch, roughly the 3rd through the 1st centuries before Christ, were centuries of near constant upheaval for Jewish communities living in Judea and the wider region. Conquest by the Persian Empire gave way to conquest by Alexander the Great's Greek Empire, which then fragmented into rival Hellenistic kingdoms that fought over the region for generations, which eventually gave way to the rising power of Rome. Foreign customs, foreign gods, and foreign rulers pressed constantly and often violently against Jewish identity, Jewish law, and Jewish worship throughout this entire period. In this specific environment, questions about the origin of corruption, Where exactly does evil come from? And why does the world seem so persistently filled with violence and forbidden, dangerous knowledge? Were not abstract philosophical puzzles. They were urgent, immediate, lived questions. Communities looking out at a world full of war, forced idolatry, and moral collapse understandably wanted an explanation that matched the true scale of what they were actually witnessing around them. The two brief verses in Genesis 6 offered a strange but strangely satisfying kind of answer, that evil's roots reached back even before the flood, into a specific moment when the boundary separating heaven and earth was directly violated by beings who had no right to cross it. For a people who valued boundaries deeply, between clean and unclean, between sacred and common, between Israel and the surrounding nations, a story about beings who crossed the ultimate boundary of all, the one separating the divine realm from the human, carried enormous symbolic and emotional weight. This anxiety about boundary crossing was not confined to religious texts alone. It shaped everyday practice, dietary law, ritual purity, marriage customs, even architecture, with the temple itself structured as a series of increasingly restricted zones separating the common world from the sacred presence at its center. A story describing beings who crossed the most fundamental boundary imaginable, uninvited and without permission, would have resonated with a community that organized nearly every aspect of daily life around the careful maintenance of exactly this kind of separation. It's in this specific world of upheaval, foreign domination, and deep boundary anxiety that the fullest surviving version of this story would eventually be written down, expanded, and carefully preserved. Consider, specifically, the pressures a Jewish community living through the 2nd century before Christ would have faced. The Seleucid Greek king Antiochus IV attempted during this exact period to forcibly suppress Jewish religious practice, reportedly desecrating the Jerusalem temple itself and outlawing central observances like circumcision and Sabbath rest, provoking the armed revolt later remembered as the Maccabean Uprising. A community living through, or in the living memory of, that kind of direct assault on its sacred boundaries would have found the Watcher story's core themes: outside forces crossing sacred lines, forbidden knowledge arriving through illegitimate channels, and the world descending into violence as a direct result. Not abstract or distant at all, but immediately, painfully recognizable as a description of their own historical moment, retold in the mythic language of the distant past. Attributed to Enoch, the mysterious figure from Genesis chapter 5, who walked with God, and, the text tells us, was simply taken by God rather than dying an ordinary death. 1 Enoch is not actually one single document, but a carefully assembled collection of several distinct sections, likely composed by multiple different authors across several centuries. It survives complete today only within the ancient Ethiopian biblical canon, but crucial fragments of it, written in Aramaic, were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in the 20th century, proving conclusively that Jewish communities living around the time of Jesus genuinely knew, read, copied, and valued this material, even though it was never formally accepted into either the Hebrew Bible or later, most Christian canons. And it is specifically in the section scholars refer to as the Book of the Watchers that Genesis's brief 2 verses become an entire, fully developed narrative with names, motives, and consequences. According to this text, 200 angelic beings, called Watchers, because their assigned role within the heavenly order had been simply to observe events on Earth, descended together to a specific mountain, traditionally identified by later tradition with Mount Hermon, on the modern border between Lebanon and Syria, and bound themselves together by a mutual, solemn oath to take human wives, in direct and deliberate violation of their created order and their assigned heavenly role. The text names their leaders individually, and the name that appears again and again throughout the narrative, carrying particular weight and particular blame, is Azazel. But here is the detail that truly separates this story from a simple account of forbidden marriage between angels and mortal women. The detail that made it dangerous and memorable enough for later tradition to preserve carefully for 2,000 years. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how remarkable the manuscript history of this text actually is. For most of European history, one Enoch was known largely by reputation and by scattered quotations in other ancient writers, rather than through direct access to the full text itself. It was the complete Ethiopian version, preserved continuously as scripture within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for well over 1,000 years, that eventually reintroduced the full text to Western scholarship in the 18th century. Then, in 1947, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves near Qumran produced Aramaic fragments of several sections of 1 Enoch, including portions of the Book of the Watchers, dated by paleographic analysis to as early as the 3rd or 2nd century before Christ, confirming, independently and conclusively, that the Ethiopian text preserved a genuinely ancient Jewish composition, not a later invention. Two entirely separate lines of preservation on two different continents, separated by centuries of scholarly silence, converging to verify the same ancient tradition. According to 1 Enoch, the Watchers did not only cross a boundary by taking human wives against the created order, they taught. The text describes Azazel specifically teaching humanity the making of weapons of war, swords, knives, shields, and the tools of organized violence, along with the crafting of jewelry and the use of cosmetics and dyes, luxuries the text frames as leading humanity toward vanity and toward violence in roughly equal measure. Other named Watcher leaders, the text says, taught forbidden knowledge of a different, equally dangerous kind, the cutting and use of roots for medicine and poison alike, the casting of spells and enchantments, the reading of omens in the movement of the stars, secrets of astrology and divination, that, in the text's own framing, humanity was simply never meant to possess this soon, or through this particular illegitimate channel. This is a genuinely crucial detail for understanding the ancient internal logic of the entire story. It is not simply a tale about angels behaving badly in a moral sense. It is, at its core, a story specifically about knowledge itself, about technology, craft, and power arriving in the human world through an illegitimate channel, entirely outside of proper divine timing and divine permission, with catastrophic and far-reaching consequences that follow directly from that illegitimacy. The offspring produced by these unions, the text tells us, were the Nephilim, described in vivid detail as giants of enormous size and terrifying appetite, consuming every available resource around them, and eventually turning violently on humanity itself once ordinary human resources could no longer sustain their needs. Violence filled the entire earth, the text says plainly. Not metaphorically, in some abstract poetic sense, but specifically and structurally, as the direct, traceable consequence of a sacred boundary that should never have been crossed in the first place. And this is precisely where the story stops being only about disobedient angels and starts becoming, in the ancient imagination, a full explanation for something much larger and more consequential still: the Great Flood itself. Later Jewish tradition, and later still, some early Christian writers, continued to develop this basic framework in various directions over subsequent centuries. Some later texts speculated about the ultimate fate of the Nephilim spirits after their physical bodies perished in the flood, suggesting they became a distinct category of malevolent spirit haunting the earth afterward, blamed in some traditions for ongoing illness, temptation, or misfortune. It's important to note that this later speculation moves considerably further from anything found in Genesis or even in 1st Enoch's earliest layers, and represents the kind of theological elaboration that naturally accumulates around a vivid, unresolved story over time. Generation after generation, community after community, each adding its own concerns and questions to an already ancient tradition. According to 1st Enoch, the widespread corruption caused by the Watchers eventually reaches the direct attention of 4 named archangels: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Uriel, who report the full extent of the devastation on earth to God, and in turn receive detailed instructions for the coming judgment. Azazel, the text tells us specifically, is bound securely and cast into darkness, into a desert place, where he is to remain until a final day of judgment still to come in the future. The other rebellious Watchers are likewise imprisoned, forced to witness the destruction their teaching helped unleash, unable to intervene in any way as the Great Flood arrives to cleanse the thoroughly corrupted earth their own choices had helped to create. It's worth pausing here to notice the underlying pattern carefully, because it is the very same pattern we find echoed elsewhere throughout Scripture and the wider tradition surrounding it: pride, or unlawful transgression, followed inevitably by a fall, followed in turn by binding or exile. The Watchers descending willfully to Hermon and permanently losing their proper place. A proud figure cast down in Isaiah's ancient taunt against Babylon. A dragon thrown down forcibly from heaven in the book of Revelation. Different texts entirely, written centuries apart by different hands, yet displaying the very same underlying shape. This is not mere coincidence so much as it is evidence of a shared theological grammar, a consistent way that ancient Jewish and early Christian communities repeatedly expressed the same core idea, that overreach by created beings, whether human or angelic in nature, reliably produces catastrophe, and that catastrophe reliably produces divine judgment in response. But the specific story of the Watchers has one more layer that genuinely sets it apart from every other fragment we've examined in this series so far, because unlike Isaiah's brief taunt or Ezekiel's poetic lament, this particular tradition did not remain safely confined to obscure, non-canonical literature. It walked directly and quite explicitly into the pages of the New Testament itself. There's one more thread worth noting about the name Azazel specifically, because it appears in the Hebrew Bible itself in a very different and much more ancient context, one that predates 1 Enoch's expanded narrative considerably. In Leviticus chapter 16, describing the rituals of the Day of Atonement, a goat is selected by Lot to be sent out into the wilderness for Azazel, carrying away the sins of the community, distinct from the goat sacrificed on the altar. Scholars have debated for a very long time whether Azazel here refers to a place, a demonic wilderness figure, or simply functions as a technical ritual term whose original meaning was already unclear even to ancient readers. What's striking, regardless of how that specific debate is resolved, is that the later Enochic tradition took a name already associated in Scripture with wilderness, exile, and the bearing away of guilt, and attached it to a specific rebellious figure bound in a desert place until judgment, suggesting the authors of First Enoch were consciously drawing on and reinterpreting an older, half-understood ritual term already present in Israel's own sacred texts. Here is a detail that genuinely surprises many readers, who mistakenly assume 1 Enoch was entirely separate from, and irrelevant to, the Bible they already know well. The New Testament letter of Jude, a short, often overlooked letter positioned near the very end of the New Testament, directly references this exact tradition, describing angels who did not keep their proper position, but instead left their own rightful dwelling, and are now being kept in eternal chains, in deepest darkness, awaiting judgment on the great final day. Many careful scholars believe Jude is drawing quite directly on the Watcher tradition preserved in 1 Enoch, and remarkably, Jude goes further still, actually quoting 1 Enoch by name just a few verses later, explicitly attributing a specific prophecy to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. The second letter of Peter contains a closely related, though somewhat less explicit, reference of its own, describing God as not sparing even the angels who sinned, but instead casting them down into gloomy pits to be securely kept there until the day of judgment arrives. This does not mean, it should be said clearly, that the New Testament treats 1 Enoch as scripture fully equal in authority to the Torah or the classical prophets. Early Christian communities debated its proper status seriously for centuries afterward, and it was ultimately excluded from most official biblical canons that emerged. But its genuine influence on how first-century Jewish and early Christian readers naturally understood Genesis chapter 6 is simply undeniable, given the evidence. When Jude's original readers first heard about angels who abandoned their proper place, they very likely already knew this fuller story well, because it had been circulating widely, read, copied, and studied for many generations by that point, exactly as the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments discovered centuries later independently confirm. The 2 brief verses in Genesis, in other words, never actually existed in true isolation, as they might first appear to a modern reader. They existed instead inside a living, evolving, actively discussed tradition, one that the New Testament writers clearly knew well, referenced directly, and, in Jude's memorable case, quoted outright by name. Jude's own letter had a somewhat complicated reception history precisely because of this quotation. Some early Christian communities questioned whether a letter that directly cited a non-canonical text as prophecy should itself be included in the New Testament canon, and Jude's status was debated, alongside a handful of other books, well into the 4th century before broad consensus was reached. That debate itself tells us something valuable. The early church took the question of which traditions carried genuine authority seriously and carefully, weighing texts individually rather than accepting or rejecting entire categories of literature wholesale. Jude survived that scrutiny and was ultimately included. 1 Enoch, despite its clear influence on Jude and its popularity among some communities, did not survive the same scrutiny into the mainstream canon, though it continued to be read, copied, and valued by many believers for centuries afterward, regardless of its formal canonical status. So what do we responsibly do with all of this? A text sitting outside the official biblical canon, describing events most modern readers have genuinely never heard of, yet clearly known, referenced, and even directly quoted by the writers of the New Testament itself. The most responsible and honest answer is not to treat 1 Enoch's Watcher narrative as literal, verifiable history in the same way we might treat a careful historical chronicle. It is instead to recognize it clearly as ancient theological literature, doing precisely what theological literature across the entire ancient Near East regularly did, using vivid, symbolic, deliberately mythic narrative to answer urgent, pressing questions about the true origin of violence, corruption, and forbidden knowledge within the world. Read carefully this way, the story of Azazel and the Watchers becomes less a literal claim about angelic biology and more a warning of striking, lasting power. That knowledge and power, when they arrive before humanity, is spiritually and morally prepared to carry them responsibly, tend to produce not genuine progress, but catastrophe instead. Weapons taught before wisdom had a chance to develop alongside them. Craft taught before restraint. Secrets taught before humility. This is a warning ancient Jewish communities living under Greek and later Roman domination, watching foreign armies, foreign gods, and disruptive foreign technologies actively reshape their entire world, clearly felt with real, immediate, personal force, not as abstract theology, but as lived experience. And it's a warning that later Jewish and Christian tradition, even while ultimately declining to formally canonize the text that told it most fully and vividly, simply could not set aside entirely. The tradition survived quietly in whispers, in Jude's brief but pointed quotation, in centuries of later art and popular folklore, precisely because the underlying question it sought to answer, where does the world's persistent violence really come from, never actually stopped being asked by any generation. It's worth noting, too, that this is not a uniquely Jewish or biblical anxiety. Other ancient cultures wrestled with strikingly similar fears about knowledge arriving before humanity was ready to bear it responsibly. Greek mythology tells of Prometheus, punished severely for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humanity ahead of its appointed time. Mesopotamian traditions similarly wrestled with questions about which forms of knowledge belonged properly to the gods, and which could be safely entrusted to mortals. The Watcher tradition, read alongside these broader currents, reflects something close to a universal ancient anxiety, given a distinctly Jewish theological shape, that power without accompanying wisdom, however it arrives and whoever delivers it, tends to bring devastation rather than genuine progress. We began tonight with just 2 verses and a single name most people have genuinely never learned before: Azazel. We end somewhere considerably more sobering than where we started. Not with definitive proof of literal fallen beings once walking mountain slopes in ancient Syria, the available evidence simply does not allow for that level of certainty, and honest, responsible history should say so plainly without hedging. But we end with a clearer, more grounded understanding of why an ancient community, staring directly at a world of violence and upheaval they could not otherwise fully explain, reached specifically for this particular story, and preserved it faithfully for 2,000 years, even from entirely outside their own official scripture. Genesis said almost nothing, deliberately, and simply let that silence stand unresolved. 1 Enoch filled that silence with a warning too specific, too vivid, and ultimately too widely known and circulated to simply disappear from memory. A warning the New Testament itself, in a single, often overlooked letter, chose deliberately to echo rather than to erase or ignore. Perhaps that is the real, lasting truth hidden within the story of the Watchers. Not that fallen beings literally once walked among us in ancient times, but that every single generation since, faced with violence it cannot fully or easily explain, has reached instinctively for the very same ancient conviction that some forms of knowledge, gained the wrong way, at the wrong time, without wisdom to guide them, always eventually demand a reckoning. 2 verses opened this investigation: a name, a mountain, a list of forbidden crafts, and a bound figure waiting in darkness closed it. Somewhere between those 2 points lies not a hidden scripture waiting to be smuggled back into the canon, but a genuinely ancient, carefully preserved record of how one faith community, under real and sustained pressure, chose to explain the violence surrounding them without ever losing sight of a final, settled judgment still to come.